the Act is intended to produce, and GBR is intended to be, a passenger and freight focused organisation. It's not about profit, it's about making a better railway for the people who use it.
Welcome to Calling All Stations, the transport podcast. I'm Christian Walmer, an author and journalist who has covered transport for the past 30 years. In every episode, we try to keep you up to date with the most engaging news stories, policy developments, and interviews in the transport world. And for this final edition of the series of the podcast, we have an exclusive, an interview with Baron Hendy of Richmond Hill, the rail minister, better known in the industry as Peter Hendy, who brings us up to date on the forthcoming Railways Bill and has some incisive thoughts about the future of the industry. I caught up with him in a hotel lounge in central London, and I'm sure that listeners will enjoy hearing his thoughts. Well, Peter, thank you very much for coming on Calling All Stations. This is obviously an interesting time for the railways, with the Railways Bill due and train operators coming back in-house and whatever. So maybe we could start with talking about the Railways Bill, because there is concern in the industry that there's nothing much happening.
Well, look, the government were elected last July. The first manifesto bill to become an act was the public ownership bill, which was entirely necessary because we'll come back to this, Christian, but taking train operations back into public ownership is an essential part of making the change to making the railway better. The substantive railway bill has been worked on ever since the election. It is a very substantial piece of legislation, for these reasons. Firstly, there hasn't been a really big railway act for 32 years. The 1993 Railways Act has been, like it or not, extraordinarily enduring.
Yeah, there were revisions of it, but they were basically the same thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Right.
And we have to make sure that this act, which might last for another 30 years, has to cover all of the subjects that actually need to be addressed in reforming the railway. And that's been quite a job. If the legislation had changed continuously over 30 years, it might be a big change, but it'd be a big change to a modern bill.
Right.
Now we're starting again.
So it's going to be a complex bill. There was some talk that it's not going to be that complex, but it's just going to be.
I think there are aspects of it which are complex because, firstly, devolution has ensured that Scotland and Wales has a very different regime from that which was over 30 years ago, and the arrangements in Scotland and the arrangements in Wales both have to be adequate, they have to be enduring, and particularly they have to be acceptable to the Scottish and Welsh Parliaments. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is the bits in the bill about access and charging, which are obviously a central feature of putting the control of the timetable and the control of the railway on a day-to-day basis back to GBR, and that is a really substantial change from the 1993 Act, and we have to work that through. There are other major changes about that change, and others changes the role of the ORR, which is the first substantial change for years. There's the setting up of the Passenger Standards Authority, which is really important for consumers who weren't really thought about in the 1993 Act.
There's a new passenger focus.
Bigger and better, and with enhanced powers. So all of those things are material. But I think just the fact that nothing's been done really in a big way for over 30 years means that this is pretty substantial stuff. Nevertheless, the bill will be in Parliament this autumn, and it will then proceed firstly, I think, through the Commons and then through the Lords. The only thing that people have seen about the progress of the legislation is actually the consultation document, which received several thousand replies, really, probably more than I'd expected, and many of them actually, interestingly, greatly in favour of the government's proposals. We will respond to that consultation at the same time as the draft bill is published, and that's a pretty big piece of work too. There are also aspects of dealing with accessibility and disability, which were raised both in the passage of the public ownership bill, which need to be addressed. So it is a pretty substantial bit of legislation. And also, actually, the other thing I'd say is that the bill is written, the Act is intended to produce, and GBR is intended to be a passenger and freight focused organisation. It's not about profit, it's about making a better railway for the people who use it. And that too is actually quite a substantial change, because the 1993 Railways Act was about carving the railway up for a completely different purpose. If you read it, it doesn't mention passengers much.
Right, it mentions competition and the like and all.
Yeah.
So just to get this straight, GBR will be responsible for the timetable, it will be responsible for strategy, it will be responsible for investment.
So, yeah, certainly the timetable. If you're going to have a competent railway authority, it has to formulate and be capable of implementing the timetable. That's one of the things that's so sadly wrong at the moment, which is that people assume that because Network Rail compiles the timetable, it can actually put it into effect, which it can't.
Because ORR has to have a stay on it.
Well, because actually there's no mechanism which arbitrates between the different parties who want paths. The ORR opines in respect of open access operators, but when it actually comes to putting it all together, Network Rail can run the meeting, but it can't say at the end of it, well, I've listened to you all and this is what we're going to do. Hence, I had to decide to implement the East Coast Main Line timetable. So Network Rail currently compiles the timetable, but it doesn't have the authority to implement it. It can chair a meeting, but it can't say at the end of it, this is what we're going to do. The ORR decides on open access, but the ORR also doesn't decide whether the timetable's fit for purpose. And we find ourselves in the most extraordinary situation where I, as the Minister, had to decide to implement the East Coast Main Line timetable because there's no one person in the railway with that authority. That's central to so many things about running the railway. It's central to why you're running trains and what trains should get precedence and why you're trying to serve. And of course GBR will need a rationale for doing that. It can't just be
Right, it'll have a set of kind of framework.
It'll have a framework, and indeed that's the purpose. That's one of the complexities of the bill, which is that there'll be a set of access and charging regulations, and there must be an appeal process because there'll still be private sector people on the railway. The chatter is that GBR will somehow decide to prioritise its own trains. GBR will have to itself comply with a set of its own rules.
Which takes in freight.
Yeah, freight and open access and anybody else who uses the railway. But what's really important is that actually to own the railway in a practical and political sense, it has to take those decisions. It then also has to own its bottom line, so it has a cost,
P&L,
P&L and income line,
profit and loss, right.
which has not been a feature of the railway at all. And in fact, the irony in the last couple of years was Network Rail, under Andrew and Jeremy, and when I was there, compiled the first whole profit and loss account for the British Railway network for nearly 30 years. Now, that's a pretty essential part of running the railway as a
So that will be part
business.
of GBR?
Yes, it will.
We'll do that?
It absolutely will.
Okay, so the other thing I asked about strategy. So who's going to decide where you're going to invest?
So as I would see it in layman's language, the Secretary of State has to decide the government's overall priorities for the railway. That's entirely proper. My nearest comparison, because I used to do the job, is the job of Transport for London, where the Mayor has an economic and spatial development strategy, and the transport strategy addresses the transport needs of the economic and spatial development strategy. In UK terms, that's clearly the job of the government to have a strategy. You don't want a sort of Soviet style, 34th left shoe factory style sort of thing, but you want to decide where you want economic progress and where you want housing jobs. And then GBR, from time to time, will put together a strategy which it will submit to the Secretary of State for the Secretary of State to say, yes, that's what I want, or I nearly want that, but here are some other
From time
things.
to time, maybe annually or every 5 years?
I think the strategy has to be longer, because you know as well as I do that railway investment takes forever and lasts forever. So if you decide to build new railways or new stations, they have to endure over 40, 50 years. So the strategy ought to be revisable, if you see what I mean. It ought to be a consistent strategy which is revised. Any new government would want to revise it, and then GBR will derive from that an investment plan, a business plan, and then a budget.
So will that be like the control period for the Network Rail, or will that merge into that, or how does that? What happens to that?
So the control period is the mechanism by which the government funds operations, maintenance and renewal of the infrastructure, and that will be preserved, because I think there's a general agreement, actually I haven't heard anybody disagree with the proposition, that actually funding it over a 5-year period produces greater efficiency. If you do it over a 1-year period, but the contractors go mad. So that will be, that won't, at least for the start, be extended to operations. It could be, but we're just replicating the different funding processes that exist now. But you can see from that, you can describe GBR as an overall controlling mind, something with a long-term strategy, an organisation that knows what it should invest in and should be competent to invest in it, and one that has an understanding of what the government's intentions are with regard to the use of the railway, which can translate it into timetables and train services.
So one of the side effects of this is you're going to basically take some powers away from the ORR.
Yes.
And does that leave the ORR with any function in the end?
It leaves it with a really important appeal function, but I think that we're very committed to the fact that if GBR has to be responsible for itself, and I think that the point about regulation is not that the regulator takes over the functions of the service provider, but it acts as a check and a brake in appropriate cases. The other point that Andrew Haynes quite frequently makes, and he's a good person to make it because he was a regulator for the civil aviation industry, is that you don't want this body, but that famously one of his predecessors as the chief executive of Network Rail, when asked where his customer was, said it's the regulator. That's nonsense. The customer of the railway are the people standing waiting for a train and the people who send freight. GBR mustn't face the regulator. The regulator's got to be part of the mechanism that ensures that GBR's on the straight and narrow. Does all that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. But it is controversial. So if an open access operator or a freight company isn't happy with what GBR decides about its paths, what happens?
It'll appeal. It'll appeal.
Right. And appeal to the ORR.
It will. And the ORR will test whether or not, in that particular case, GBR has followed its own processes and its own guidance about access, which is in a sense what happens. Well, it's better than what happens now, because the ORR can decide these things, and frankly, the rest of the railway's got to fit round them as a consequence.
So, do you think as a result of this, there'll be fewer open access trains, or more, or the same level? So
here's the interesting thing. Despite all the chatter, the recent open access applications which were rejected were rejected by the ORR on the basis of track capacity. Of capacity.
Right.
They didn't have to opine whether or not they were going to be diminishing the public sector operators' revenue.
Yeah.
The trains wouldn't fit on the railway.
Abstracting revenue is there, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's going to be more and more common. One of the reasons to have a decent long-term plan for the railway is to have a greater understanding about where the capacity limitations of the railway are, and hence what needs to be done about them. And it's a whole separate subject about the West Coast Main Line, but practically the West Coast Main Line is full. The railway has relied on government and external bodies to make the case for capacity enhancement, when actually, frankly, it should have made the case itself. I think it's pretty weak frankly, that the development of HS2 has been outside the conventional railway. Somebody sort of deciding separately from the railway what the problem was and what the solution was, and look where we are with that. So I do think that actually the railway has a duty to plan in the light of what the government wants and with regard to the government's priorities, and I would look to see that manifests itself where there's a shortage of capacity, which there is in many places. The railway is fundamentally different from where it was 30 years ago. 30 years ago, there's all sorts of white space in a timetable. You could double some services without congestion. You can't do that now, and therefore a plan for the future and what you do in terms of enhancements, in terms of getting additional trains on the network, the length of the trains, the capacity of them, has to be much more attended to.
Okay, well, you brought us nicely on to a subject that is, to say the least, problematic, which is HS2. How do you see that going, and where do you see that changing possibly with with Northern Powerhouse Rail or whatever? I mean, what are your plans for that?
So the first thing to say is that HS2 has been and is in a rather terrible state, and the appointment of Mark Wilde as the chief executive is a great appointment. He's the guy who sorted out Crossrail, turned it into an operating railway. I know he'll do the same here because I know him, and so does Heidi. Mike Brown, who succeeded me at TfL, is going to be the chair of HS2. He will refresh the board, which is a good thing. We need to get the existing project under control, and before anybody talks about any extensions or anything else to do with this, you're never going to persuade anybody, whether in the Treasury or elsewhere, to invest more money until you can prove that you can spend the money.
But the Acton to Aston shuttle, as I've called it, is useless. I mean, it's not going to be well used.
Well, so the government did decide to take it to Euston, which is the right thing to do.
But work hasn't started on it yet. The TBMs are there, but
the TBMs are there. I wouldn't be surprised if it started before long.
Right.
And one of the things that Mark has to do is work out what the process to completion of the Old Oak Common to Curzon Street piece is, as against to what we can do with the Old Oak Common to Euston piece, because actually the purpose of Old Oak Common to Curzon Street might be to test the railway and bed it in, but it's not going to be a serious proposition for large quantities of travel.
No.
Euston to Birmingham certainly is. So, but the first thing he's got to do is find out how much work has been done, what's left to do, how long it's going to take, and how much it's going to cost. And the fact that we're in that position is dire.
And when will that happen by?
He's doing it now, but what we want to do is to have something we can rely on at the end of it. It's more important he does it well than he does it quickly. None of us can live, and the country can't live with that piece of work being done badly.
Right.
So he's doing it now. I think we have to wait for him to be satisfied, and the fact that he's got to start by finding out how much has been done, the fact that we're starting still at this stage with a project where not all the design is complete, really, but that's where we are. So £7 billion per year is being allocated to HS2 for the next 3 or 4 years. Yeah.
Is that taking money away from the rest of the railway?
Well, I think we've got a generous settlement, frankly. If you add that 7 to the 4 that is being spent on enhancements, I mean, go back in history, I don't think any recent government spent 11 billion a year on the railway. And people can deride HS2, but it does have a strong economic purpose, and it will be good when it's finished. But the other thing I'd say about HS2, which I feel very passionate about, is that it should never have been conceived as a separate network. The railways of Great Britain are one network. When you turn up at Euston, eventually, it shouldn't matter whether you're a passenger to Bushy, or a passenger to Milton Keynes, or a passenger at Birmingham Curzon Street. You should be looking at a railway which is part of the network.
And you think it was developed as a separate?
Oh yes, it was.
Right.
Absolutely. And one of the jobs that Mark has to do is to get a structure in place so that it can become part of the railway network. And ironically enough, it's the same thing that he had to do with the Elizabeth line. One of the things that both Mike Brown and I will tell you is that the people who built Crossrail, civil engineered Crossrail, had this belief that they were building a new and completely different railway, and of course they're not. When you look at how it's used, it's part of the system. You know, when I've finished here, I'm going to go down to Bond Street and go to Liverpool Street.
Right.
I could go on the Central Line, but the Elizabeth Line's better and quicker. And I see the HS2 as an integral part of the British railway network, which means we've got to make sure that the trains are suitable. They were in any event going to travel on the conventional network north of Crewe or wherever it was. They got to fit into the stations like Manchester. And whilst they'll be shiny, new and fast, it's got to be, well, the TGV in France is part of the French railway network. It's not something different that's so totally, totally separate. And HS2 will have to be the same. The HS2 trains, for the foreseeable future anyway, after it opens, will probably spend, apart from Euston to Birmingham, all the rest of them will probably spend more time on the original network than they will on the new one.
So, Peter, just to finish off on HS2, the trains that have been ordered, are they suitable trains for what you envisage them to be, as kind of mainly running off the HS2 bit, or are you going to have to kind of order new trains?
So, they were designed to be able to run on the conventional network. So the design is quite satisfactory. What Mark needs to work through is what configuration of those trains is needed for the network that will actually be operated. And if you think about it, there are two different bits of that network. One is the service between London Euston and Birmingham Curzon Street, which will stop at Old Oak Common and Birmingham Interchange. Those trains will be long trains with high capacity, and they're the design that's been ordered. The rest of the trains that serve those places served on the national network, where the trains will use will use HS2 and then go on the national network. What Mark needs to do is to work out what configuration those trains need to be, how long they should be. They'll be the same design, but they can't fit in the platforms. They got to fit in the platforms at Manchester.
So they might be shorter.
They might be shorter.
Right. And you haven't sorted that out yet.
No, is the answer to that.
Right.
So one of Mark's jobs is to address a whole series of issues. Sort out the civil engineering, sort out the railway, the equipment of the railway systems, electrification and signalling, sort out the configuration of the trains, and then also a really big job, which is the one he did too with Crossrail, which is to integrate. You've got to test the railway, make sure it works properly, and then you've got to devise a really intricate plan to integrate those services into the rest of the railway. And the point is, of course, that can't be done in isolation. It has to be done. By that time, Great British Railways will be operating. It will be thinking about what passenger services are needed, and what Mark needs to do is to integrate this brand new railway with its systems and its trains into the railway that we've already got to produce the best service of passengers.
Right.
It can be done. It's been done on Crossrail, but it's not the same as building it, and that's been one of the real difficulties with these projects, which is that people who build them think of them as a civil engineering project, and what we all want, what the government wants, what the passengers want, is a railway that works for them. They're not the same thing.
So that brings us neatly on to National Transport Strategy, or National Integrated Transport Strategy. That was something that was announced by Louise Haigh. Is that something that's happening, and are you having input into that?
It is, and I am.
Right. What is
National Transport Strategy, it is happening, and I'm involved in it. What it will seek to set out, what people often say about the transport networks in Britain is that whether or not they work individually, they don't work together. And simple things like the use of cycles to and from stations, and the use of taking cycles on trains. Simple things like whether bus services serve railway stations or not. Simple things like whether the railway station's actually part of the community, and whether it's integrated into cycling and walking and things like that. have not been considered on an all-round basis in Britain for many years. People contrast us unfavourably with places like Holland, which has wholly integrated ticketing and that sort of thing. And for me, the integrated transport strategy is a way of getting those issues out on the table and a way of getting some granular change, betterment into what those things are.
So it is about integration rather than looking at all transport policy as a whole and integrating it. It's about kind of integration on the ground.
I'm sure it will have a high level which will seek to describe what transport does for the economy and society.
Right.
But for me, because I'm that sort of person, actually turning it into things that could be done better for the benefit of the people who use it is the practical sense. And if you think about, Simon Lightwood and I have had some real discussions about rail replacement buses and how being polite, what a large contrast they are with the railway service that they're replacing. It's that sort of stuff actually. And for me, some practical rules about that. There's Plus Bus, which is a ticket addition to railway fares to use on buses in local towns and cities. It's sort of good, but it isn't.
Does anybody buy it, really?
Yeah, they do. Some people do buy it, but if you know about it. But contrast that with pay-as-you-go on every mode of transport in Manchester. There's no comparison, is there?
Right.
That's what we're trying to achieve, and actually some of that technically is quite difficult to do. So both Andy Burnham in Manchester and Mayor Parker in Birmingham are really keen on pay-as-you-go across all their modes of transport. There's a lot of work going on in the department in order to do the technical work to make that happen. It was easy in London because we were in control of it all in the first place, but it isn't as easy there. And what we want is a standard there which will roll out across urban areas in Britain and mean that when passengers want to travel somewhere, they're not endlessly wondering about what the fare level is and what you have to pay, which is, as you know, one of the reasons that local bus services outside London are that people don't use them because they don't understand where they go, how they work, or how you pay.
I'm always slightly terrified when I arrive somewhere and I think, I'd like to take a bus, but how do I pay for it?
Yeah, well, at your age you shouldn't be.
I know.
Because the English National Concessionary Bus Pass works.
Sometimes they accept it and sometimes they don't.
But if you don't have one, it is a mystery, actually, right. And it shouldn't be, should it? Actually, and we can do better with that. And all the work that, for example, a huge amount of work going on in railway fares ticketing and revenue, and part of that work is to get us into a technological place where you can use use your bank card on anything,
right?
As you would in London.
Do you think that rail is? You're Minister for Transport in the Lords. Do you think that rail gets more than its fair share of money, attention, investment? Because there's a lot of people who think that it does in proportion to the number of people using it.
Well, look, actually, in the largest urban areas, it is still the backbone of travel to work in a way that would make them entirely untenable as civilised places. And that's not just true in London, it's true in other major cities too. Intercity rail is streets better and more environmentally friendly than travelling by any other mode. And when you next think of going to Manchester or Newcastle, would you ever consider flying?
Yeah, if you're going to Manchester.
Yeah, if you're ever going to Manchester or Liverpool, or as I did the other day, went to Cornwall, would you consider flying? Well, you might, but there's a couple of flights a day to Newquay, but actually there's an hourly train service. So the railway's relevant, and the railway's been relevant, since it's 200 years. It's been relevant for 200 years. It's that it was and is the principal means of urbanisation. So it's pretty important. And actually, on the one hand, everything you do on the railway in capital expenditure is very large scale cost. On the other, some of it lasts for a very long time. Brunel's Great Western Railway is at least fully written down in the accounts, isn't it?
His bridge is still there in Plymouth, yes.
Yeah, and actually, when next weekend, or whenever you're going to do this, in a few days' time, when we have the celebrations in Stockton and Darlington, that train to celebrate 200 years will go over a bridge built in 1825. So the stuff that you're building lasts a long time. And actually, I don't think you can resent the money that you spend on the railway. What I do think is we should spend it better and get more from it, and that's the government's intention.
Right. And do you think that, for example, it's a good idea to have a third runway at Heathrow? I mean, is that,
Well, government policy is to develop Heathrow, and I'm in the government, so I'm in support of it. I don't have any problem with that.
Right.
If you're in a position where the country is desperate for economic growth because the standard of living needs to go up and a lot of public services need to be paid better, then it makes sense for the Chancellor to concentrate on those things that are likely to produce it, doesn't it?
Right.
Ergo, do what's sensible.
I mean, do you actually want... Look, Scotland's just brought in this policy of abolishing peak fares. And we haven't really talked about fares. I mean, would you like to see a rationalisation of the fare system? And do you actually want to see more people using the railways? I mean, do you want a modal shift?
So, yes, you do want more people using the railway. It's good in environmental terms. It's good to use the capacity. It justifies the investment. What's the most crucial thing in railway finance at the moment? The most crucial thing in railway finance is that the subsidy from the Treasury has doubled since COVID. And there's no point in shying away from it, and Heidi doesn't do that either, which is that one of our jobs has to be to reduce the subsidy on the railway. When you make fares decisions, the balance is between, and it's always been, between what the taxpayer pays and what the fare payer pays, and actually, I'm not the Scottish government. They've got to take decisions about Scotland based on their financial position. It might also be connected with the fact that an election is not far away. So
it's popular. So it'll be popular here.
Well, but you've also got to make the economy of the country work. I sit next to my Treasury colleague in the Lords, who has to stand up about once a fortnight and remind the opposition that they left a black hole of 22 billion quid, and they did. And actually,
but you think that policy would lead to a lowering of the revenue of the railways? Well, if you abolish peak fares.
Well, we'll see. It's going to cost them 40 or 50 million quid a year in the first place. We'll see what happens.
It depends if it gains that amount of people onto the railways, and you're shifting people.
Well, the other issue is you've got to be able to cope with the capacity, which is with you've got to have capacity to cope with whatever is generated.
Right.
We'll see is the answer. They can take that decision. As far, we as always, it's a difficult line to balance, because actually you do want a fare structure that's understandable and affordable. You asked me whether it could be better configured, and of course it could. 50 million fares on a railway network this size is mad, and we're going to do something about it. But actually the choices between taxpayer subsidy and what you pay are pretty limited in circumstances where the national economy needs to recover from where it's been with the previous government. So you're not, if you're not where you like to be, you're certainly where you are.
What would you do you think GBR will have a big fares reconfiguration? I mean, will it?
We've already started. None of it makes sense to people. I said so this morning in the Lords. So on long distance, the LNER's fares trials, which are now in either their second or third development, are producing fares which give some element of flexibility. Many of them are cheaper than advance fares, and actually it looks as though it's going quite well from the customer's angle. We need to develop that and apply it to the other big main lines in urban areas.
So you think the LNER thing you're going to of translate across the network?
Well, it certainly seems to be popular with people, and actually the volumes of tickets sold in this this flex configuration are huge, and some of the previously favoured ticket types are going down, so customers, passengers are understanding what's being offered, which sounds quite good to me. And one of the issues is that actually, if you look at conventional fares for long distance travel, this distinction between peak and off peak is really rather arid now.
Yes, I mean people are. I've travelled on peak trains that are half empty.
And so have I, and that's a good reason to change the structure, right? Because actually, it makes no sense for tickets on a train out of Euston at 8:30 in the morning to cost £200 when actually the first train out after off peak at 9:32 is full to the doors and costs a third of the price. That can't make sense. So you've got to make something out of that. The urban areas are simpler because we're already on with pay-as-you-go. We're extending pay-as-you-go in London to outside the GLA boundary. That's quite well on. We added 40 odd stations, and there are more to come. Doing it in Manchester and Birmingham is very important, and I referred to that before. And there's huge keenness to do that from the relevant mayors. It's some of the technology and the pricing issues that need to be solved.
So do we have a time frame for when we might have a national fare system?
Well, I was asked that this morning. It's like, it is eating an elephant. You've got to start somewhere. Don't anybody believe that you can wake up overnight and change it all. When we brought in Oyster and then pay-as-you-go in London, we evolved the fares system over several years, and I think that's what we'll have to do here, because the volume of technical work involved is huge to do these things.
I have an idea that you simply just go for off-peak fares, and then you have premium trains. So you might have a 30% train or a 50% train that has a premium on it, or you might have a 30% off or 50% off train, then simple.
So if David Horn were here from LNER, he'd say it's a bit more complicated than that, and it's more complicated than that because the 8:30 from King's Cross, which you might think is a peak train, by the time it gets to York is an off-peak train. And if your journey is 5 hours, you know, the other way round actually, the train to Cornwall at 14:03 out of Penzance is a peak train at Plymouth.
Right. Okay.
So you've got to be a bit and the other thing, which is also a development in the last 30 or 40 years, is that, you know, Heidi's constituencies in Swindon, but I would use that example because I used to go through it on the way from Bath, which is that Swindon 40 years ago wasn't a place that people commuted to London. Swindon now is a place that you commute to London. People do it
through an hour.
Yeah, and there's 6 trains an hour. It's far more frequent than the Metropolitan line, and people do it. So you've got to find a fare structure that embraces people's need to commute, as well as leisure journeys and once-off business journeys. And it's not simple. And actually, you ought to talk to David Horn and Suzanne Donnelly, who works for him, because I think LNER are pretty sophisticated at it. There was a lot of overt criticism in the trade media when they started doing this, but the results, not what people are saying, but the results and the numbers of people buying their new ticket structure appear to me and to them to be justifying what they're doing.
Okay, Peter, I think I'll give you a rest now. I think that's been a very, very comprehensive. Just one last question. As somebody who started a political career in your 70s, has it been fun?
Yeah, most days. It's hard work. But so look, my reflections are, I'm very lucky. I felt enormously privileged to be asked to do this. I feel very lucky to be able to be in changing the railway. Andrew and I sat there for most of my 9 years and his 7 years, being promised that reform was coming without it coming. Actually having a hand in it is really good. The Lords is different from the Commons, of course, but what I would say is that I sit on the Lords Labour front bench with some extraordinarily talented people who know a great deal. I'm in awe of some of their knowledge. I only talk about things I know about, but I feel a bit of a pygmy amongst giants, and there are people there who understand the processes much better than me, but they're passionate in this government in wanting to make a real change. And it's a delight to be with people like that. The bit I don't like is getting home at 1 o'clock in the morning or 2 o'clock in the morning because the opposition have been fruitlessly arguing for a long time. But that's part of the job, isn't it?
Absolutely. And okay, well, just one supplementary. When is GBR going to happen?
There's a longer answer to that. The bill will be in Parliament this autumn. You can create GBR at a stage during the bill before Royal Assent. But the thing I really want to say is we're not waiting for GBR to make the railway better. It's essential for the things we discussed before, which is getting a timetable straight and getting control and getting a long-term plan, but we're starting now. So Lawrence Bowman on the southwestern and Steve White on the southeastern, in a few days' time, Jamie Bells at Anglia, will be each in charge of an integrated railway, which is the expression of what GBR is going to deliver on the ground. And if you say, well, what have they done? I'll tell you what the answer is. Lawrence inherited a pretty ropey operating organisation when he took over in May. Of the 90 trains that had been bought, 84 of them were sitting in sidings, and they had been for bloody years. And he's got 21 of them out now when he only had 6 3 months ago. He's
Right.
working like he's got the management together. He's working like a Trojan. He's going around every MP in his area, as is Steve White, introducing himself. I'm in charge of the railway. There's nowhere else to go. What can I do for you? All good stuff. And that's the manifestation of this policy at a level where you can actually see it. And if you want independent corroboration, which I was really pleased about, I happened to be listening to Transport Questions in the Commons last week, and John Glenn, the MP for Salisbury, who is now in the opposition, Conservative MP, had met Lawrence the previous Friday, and he said what a privilege it was to meet somebody who's in charge of the railway. And for me, that's the absolute expression of this. Lawrence is there to produce a bloody decent service for passengers and for stakeholders, and he's got the means under his control to do it. And what I've told him is, and what I've said to Steve is, I don't ever want to hear you blaming anybody else for something that's gone wrong, because it's all in your control, and this is so important. When I ran TfL, I woke up every morning, whatever was wrong on my phone, it was our fault and we had to fix it. And that's the spirit that you've got to do. If you want to deal with customers and deal with freight and get a better railway, the first thing you've got to believe is that you're in control and you can fix the problem, and you generally can. And Lawrence and Steve and Jamie, when he gets there, will be educating gently the people who come under their control to deliver better railway for passengers, to generate more revenue and to reduce the cost.
Peter, that's great. You sound almost like a politician there. That's perfect.
Well, I sound convincing because I am convinced, and it's right too. It's got to be right.
Right.
There you go. How's that?
That's absolutely fabulous.
Calling All Stations, the Transport Podcast with Christian Walmart, is produced by Cogitamus Limited, a leading provider of public affairs consultancy services in the sector. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have, please consider giving us a 5-star rating with whichever platform you use. Do follow us on social media channels, including Blue Sky, Facebook, and X, formerly known as Twitter. Our handle on X is @AllStationsPod.